Evet, hoş geldiniz. Bugün Profesör Oliver Turnbull'u burada İstanbul'da 3. kez ağırlamaktan gurur duyuyoruz. Hepinizi Türkiye Nöropsikanaliz ve Çınar adına karşılıyorum. Ve umarım bu seminer sizin için çok keyifli olacak ve faydalı olacak. Biraz İngilizceye geçiş yapacağım misafirimizin de bizi anlaması için. Kendisini tanıyorsunuz ama kısaca bir özgeçmişinden bahsedeceğim. Professor Turnbull is a neuropsychologist with an interest in emotion and its many consequences for mental life. He is also a clinician whose medical work is with neurological and neurosurgical patients. He is the author of roughly 180 scientific articles on these topics, and together with Mark Solms, he is the co-author of the popular science book, The Brain and the Inner World, which you can also attain today at our registration desk. The book has been translated into 11 languages, including Turkish. Professor Hakan Atalay had translated the book to Turkish and helped us to convey the knowledge to more people in Turkey. Professor Turnbull is also the Deputy Vice Chancellor at Bangor University, and now I would like to welcome him for this lovely seminar today.
Well, thank you, Gotcha. You're very, very kind. It's always lovely to be here. I think this is my third trip to Istanbul, and I've enjoyed all of my previous visits. I'm sure this one will be great. Can you all hear me reasonably clearly? And I hope I speak at the right pace. Sometimes people accuse me of speaking too fast. So if I do speak too fast, put your hand up and I'll try to slow down. So, okay. I also need to stand on this side of the board. So just to give you a feeling for who I am, let's hope these slides work. This is my university, Bangor. It's a city in North Wales, sort of down the road from Liverpool. I suppose if you know your British geography, we're quite well connected throughout the world. Here are some of our Chinese students, and we've been around for a long time. That's me, obviously. I also run a lab focused on emotion and its relation to brain injury, where we have Masters and PhD students. And I work as part of the North Wales Brain Injury Service a little bit of the time. I hardly see any patients, but I'm very kind to say that I'm still a clinician. I'm still on the register of clinicians, which is good, where we study patients with brain injury and how their emotional lives are changed. I run, most famously, a neuroanatomy summer school every summer for about 40 international students. Here are some of our students, here are some of our faculty. I paint brains in my spare time, so this is one of my brain paintings. We teach neuroanatomy through the medium of drawing, and just to show you how obsessed I am with brains, that is my 50th birthday cake, which I think is unique amongst 50th birthday cakes, actually. And I've been connected with neuropsychoanalysis for a very long time. I hope you recognize some of these characters, including Katerina Panksepp over here. That's Katerina, and that's Mark Solms. And I've only ever once before had a photograph with one of our translators. So that is the Japanese translator. But this evening we have the great honor of our Turkish translator. So thank you very much. Maybe I'll put your picture up there next time. How about that? And as it turns out, I'm also 1 week ago delivered a TEDx talk. If you're interested in those, it'll only be out in December. My son, who's that person over there, did the slides. We did it in this remarkable hall in my university, which has some very psychoanalytically themed paintings in the background. So that's just to give you a feel for the sort of person that I am. So I'm going to talk today about the neuroscience of psychotherapy. It's very hard to potentially bridge those two very different disciplines. So let's give a perspective really on the nature of the psychotherapies. I'm very taken with a quote by Mark Solms, which is that our patients suffer mainly from feelings. That is, so many disorders, psychiatric disorders, are of emotions that are very powerful, that patients struggle to tolerate, and that they would love to escape from, except that the one truth about feelings is that you can't escape from them, except maybe temporarily through sleep. So the question is how we can try to help our patients to manage these feelings, and what we know about the brain that would help us to try to understand that process. So I will talk about the psychotherapies in the sense that they help us, of course, to manage our feelings. That's the one common element, I think, across all of them, in many ways through a process that's usually described as emotion regulation. But it's going to take me at least half an hour before I talk about emotion regulation, because first, of course, I'd like to talk about emotion. I'd like to talk about the brain basis of feelings, because that's at the heart of trying to understand what the psychotherapies are trying to tackle. Okay, so I'm going to deal with the basic emotions first, and how they might have a role to play in disorders of mental health, and what the brain basis is, and then I'll talk about the regulation, the management of feelings, and what we've done in our lab to try to tackle that. So, when Mark says that these feelings are very ancient and powerful, no problem, what do we know about those? The first of the two principles that I always like to talk about is that feelings are old, evolutionarily old. They belong in some very ancient brain areas. Before even discussing that topic, I'd like to remind us that we are in a discipline which has, for at least some of its history, denied the existence of feelings. I've just been talking about how our patients struggle with feelings, and yet in the middle of the last century, we had academic psychology, or at least an important part of it, denying that feelings existed at all. This is, of course, the behaviorist revolution. I have a complex attitude towards behaviorism. This is the founder of the field, Watson, who I think had what could be a defensible attitude towards the mind, which is that he doesn't deny that it exists, he just thinks that it's hard to study. And I can sort of understand that argument. What I can't live with is the Skinnerian position, which is that the mind doesn't exist at all. So here's an infamous quote from Skinner, which is that emotions are excellent examples of the fictional causes to which we commonly attribute behavior. Fictional causes. If that's true, then we're all zombies, we're all robots, automata, and you can treat your friends terribly because they don't have feelings, they're just other zombies, like us. It's a really immoral position in my opinion, and I think we're well rid of those ideas. Not that there aren't some very good things that came out of the behaviorist revolution, but not the denial of mind. Let's show you how pervasive that influence has been. This is a survey that my then PhD student Christian Salas and I did of a textbook. We actually did a couple to see what fraction of textbook time in the mental sciences are dedicated to cognition, that is the clever bits of the mind, versus emotion. And here's the appalling stat from one of the textbooks we chose, the Ramachandran one, which is that about 40% of the text dedicated to cleverness and 2% of the time dedicated to feelings. Even though if you ask people why they care about their minds, or even psychology students why they study psychology, it will be because I care about personality and feelings and how we can help other people. And yet actually so little of the field is dedicated to those powerful emotions. I think it's changing, but unfortunately only very slowly. Okay, so what can we say about the brain basis of feelings? I'll rephrase that as saying, what can we say about the brain basis of emotion? Because that's not quite the same thing as the brain basis of feelings. If I'd been giving this talk in the 1970s, not only would I have been a lot younger, but I would have been likely to say something a little different about the brain basis of emotion. There was a very influential attitude towards emotions back then, which was the hemispheric asymmetry account, suggesting that the right cerebral hemisphere is more involved in emotional aspects, for example, of the perception of angry versus happy versus sad speech, or the perception of angry versus happy versus sad faces. And that literature is simultaneously completely correct still and fundamentally misleading. It's correct in that it's true. You do need your right cerebral hemisphere in order to tell the difference between a happy and a sad face, or a happy and a sad voice. But telling the difference between facial expressions is a complex cognitive task. It's a clever task. It's not a task of feelings. knowing that a face is very happy or very sad is very different from the joy that we experience when something wonderful happens or when something terrifying happens to us. So we need not to focus on what I would call the cognitive aspects of emotion, which are interesting, but I don't care about cleverness. I'm interested in the visceral, motivational, powerful aspects of feelings, and those are not to be found in the new, clever, outside parts of the brain. We need to go much older in order to make progress there. Here's a paper we published a couple of years ago to try to make this point. We gave 2 different kinds of tasks to people who were suffering from very strong feelings. This is complicated grief, which are people who are bereaved and of course are mourning their loss. The complicated grief group are people who can't overcome those and are still feeling profoundly sad about it after more than 18 months, I think is the DSM cutoff. And this is a symptom magnitude for a range of different symptoms. You don't need to worry about the details. Self-report data. And everyone in this group has been bereaved more than 2 years ago, and half of the population haven't overcome their grief yet, and the other half have. And the people with complicated grief have about double the symptom magnitude in any one of these categories. So they're saying, I'm profoundly sad, I'm, I have increased phobias and so on. So very powerful effects. As you can see well outside any error bars that you've got there. We also investigated their ability to tell happy from sad versus angry faces. And I'd like to show you a graph, but there's no point because we didn't publish the graph in the paper, because there were no differences between the groups in any of the emotional face categories. So of course, they can tell the difference between a sad and an angry face. But of course, this group are also overwhelmed by sadness or anger. We need to focus on that subjective experience and not on tests of clever things, in my opinion. So where are these powerful feelings? It turns out that we've known the answer probably since the middle of the last century. This is James Olds's work in the early 1950s on direct stimulation to the brain, ESB, in which they put an electrode in the brain. And you probably know this work. They find brain areas in which animals would rather press self-stimulation of their own brain than have food. In fact, they choose it over food, water. The males choose it in preference for females whom they could have sexual encounters with, and the females choose it in preference for their pups. And they cross electrical shocking grid wire in order to get it. There's nothing that animals want more than electrical stimulation of these brain areas, like the septal nucleus. There's a very unethical experiment done in 1972 in which they do the same thing in a human being, which if you'd like to read about unethical experiments, you're welcome to try to read. Enormously powerful for these animals. So that's what happens if you stimulate the ancient subcortical brain areas. What happens if you damage the new brain areas? Here's some work that we did after lesions to different parts of the cerebral cortex. And a short version of that study, those studies are, it makes no difference to most of their emotional lives. That is, our patients still have happiness, sadness, anger, and fear, like any other sorts of patient groups. They're changed in other ways, and I'll come back to that in the second half of the talk, emotion regulation ways. How else do we know that the cerebral cortex isn't important for feelings? Here's a paper we published on erogenous sensation, and a couple of years ago, which included the work from Penfield and Rasmussen, if you know the electrical stimulation work, before they have neurosurgery to primary somatosensory cortex. You'll all be familiar with the homunculus, the little person that is identified in primary somatosensory cortex. You would think that if you stimulated the genital areas of that with direct brain stimulation, people would find it very erogenous. But the answer is absolutely not. Here's the famous Penfield quote. After 400 patients in surgery, curiously enough, we have never produced erotic sensations of any sort by electrical stimulation. So doing things to the new, clever outside part of the brain makes no difference to powerful emotions. If you want to look for the source of powerful emotions, you need to go old. you need to go to the ancient evolutionary core of the brain. And here's a nice study by Tony Damasio nearly 20 years ago now, in which they put patients in a scanner when they're generating emotional feelings. So they lie there and think about things which make me feel sad, and they think repetitive thoughts like, they've dumped me, I'll never meet another person that will care for me, I'm going to be alone forever. In their study, they could find people who were able to cry in the scanner, actually. And you can see here, it's a subtraction methodology. So they're compared with the baseline. Let's concentrate on the sadness condition. I'll make it a little bit bigger here. There are three things I think you need to know about this diagram. The first of them is, look how powerful the activation is in a range of subcortical areas, from the brainstem forward through the hypothalamus, in this case to the anterior cingulate, a first fact. The second thing you need to know is, look how symmetrical these effects are. There's no hemispheric asymmetry at the level of the brainstem. It's only in the clever parts, the new clever parts of the brain, that you see asymmetry. So there's as much activation left as right. And then here is the cerebral cortex. These changes in purple are areas of deactivation, and the other brain areas aren't changed at all. So when these people are thinking about the loss of someone they love, they're not thinking clever thoughts. They're thinking simple, profound, repetitive, ruminative thoughts about how the person they love, they'll never see them again, and they've just been rejected. So they're very simple, but very powerful thoughts for our patients. They're the ones that our patients are struggling to deal with. Other work on the drive states. We've known since the middle of the last century that you can change eating and drinking preferences after hypothalamic lesions. There's some interesting work on sexual preferences, but I won't talk about that here. And we even know, we think, something about the number of these basic emotions. Gotcha, now we're having a chat earlier about this, about what the magic number is. There's a lot of debate in my field, but no one disagrees. No one chooses a number any lower than 4. This is Paul Ekman's category, which arguably is happiness, sadness, anger, and fear. Ekman has 2 extra emotions, surprise and disgust. Here's the Jaak Panksepp version of the story. Again, slightly different names, the same core 4 that everyone agrees on, and some extra ones that we can discuss. The short answer is that we have a number of basic emotions, which is relatively small in total. They also seem to be reasonably selective. You can have selective loss of individual emotions. This is Andy Calder's work on the selective loss of disgust. I will show you the next slide, but it is a bit disgusting. So shall I do it? Okay. So this is from Ralph Adolph's patient after an insular lesion. Patient B was unable to recognize disgust in any of the stimuli we used, including the descriptions of actions and spontaneous labeling of dynamic facial expressions. When told a story of a person vomiting, his descriptions included feeling hungry and delighted. Seems a little unusual. I particularly like, well, it's a bit disgusting, this last bit. When observing the experimenter act out the apparent vomiting of unpalatable food, accompanied by retching sounds and facial expressions. That is, the experimenter goes in front of the patient. B's description was that delicious food was being enjoyed. And I'm not sure there's anybody in the room here who thinks that I was imitating delicious food being enjoyed. So we know something about the anatomy of these systems. I showed you some pictures earlier that the anatomy moves from upper brainstem areas through the hypothalamus towards, depends on the particular category of emotion, in this particular case, the anterior cingulate. And here we have 2 mammal species for whom these are color-coded. Humans, of course, in the top, and the guinea pig, for heaven's sake, in the lower diagram. And you can see basically the same color-coded set of nuclei involved in both cases. Of course, you say to me, human beings are not guinea pigs. And the difference between us and guinea pigs is around the top here. All this extra new cleverness. We're much cleverer than guinea pigs. But the core of sadness is probably identical in both species. I think it's a fact that I'm not sure as a population we've quite come to terms with, but that's another story. Oh, the other difference is, of course, that they are quadrupeds. So they have a brainstem that comes out horizontally. But apart from that, probably no big differences. Okay, so what I would like to say in the next few minutes, based on what I've said already really, is that we are at what I think is a very interesting time in the mental sciences. And you know you're in an interesting time for a science when you have a simple explanation that brings together very diverse fields. And that's why I have a picture of Isaac Newton over here. We're all impressed by Newton because he's able to say in the 1600s that the force which involves apples dropping out of trees is the same force that involves the moon rotating around the earth. And those are, at first principle, such completely different things that the idea that a single phenomenon could explain such diversity is what makes Newton a genius. I think, I'm not claiming that our field is in quite that same category as physics, but we are in a situation in which different chapters in the psychology textbook, or indeed the psychiatry textbook, but especially the psychology textbook, different categories are actually just reflections of a single underlying phenomenon expressed in different sorts of ways. And for me, those three categories are firstly, basic emotion systems. The things which make feelings, it turns out, are the reasons that we use recreational drugs. That's the reason we use them, is in order to change feelings. And they are the same brain chemistries which organic psychiatry uses to try to treat patients. And those have traditionally been three different chapters in the textbooks, but I put it to you that it's really the same thing, viewed from three different perspectives. And that's why I think we're in a sort of Newtonian-like position. It is also interesting to consider the role of conscious awareness in all of this, but that's a different matter. So I'd like to try to look at these three phenomena, and I'll do it for two completely different categories of basic emotion system, and see if I can get my point across for you. And in order to make this point, I'm going to talk about a distinction that my field often uses between wanting versus liking. It's Jaak Panksepp talks about it too, but I'm going to use this example because it's Kent Berridge who developed the terminology in the 1990s. The answer is that Kent Berridge is not 12 years old. He just looks 12 years old in this picture, and he makes a very important distinction here between two very different categories of things, both of which are pleasurable. You might call them happiness, but happiness is a terrible word for an emotion scientist to use because it has so many different manifestations. So the distinction that Berridge wants to make is between a wanting system, which is a system that expends energy. It burns your fuel in order for you to go out there and look in the world for the thing that you want. It doesn't tell you, by the way, what you should like. Jaak has an interesting phrase that he used to use, but it's a low frequency word in English. He said that it's a goad without a goal. I don't know what the Turkish translation for goad is, but it's like a stick that you would prod somebody with. So it's a motivation which doesn't identify what you should do with it. The analogy I like to use is it's like the petrol that you put in your car. It gives your car the energy to drive somewhere, but whether you drive to the library or the beach, the car is indifferent to this. The job of petrol is just to give you the energy to do it. And this system, the wanting system, is what's giving you the energy to go and look for the thing that you want. There is then another way of having pleasure, which Berridge calls a liking system. This is not an energy burning system, it's a conservation system. And it's what happens once you get the thing you want. And here are two pictures of people who've got the thing that they want, and they're now conserving energy. It's a very different category of motivation, and it involves a very different set of brain systems. So let's go through them one at a time and see if I can identify the emotion system, and then the recreational drug use, and then the role in organic psychiatry. So we know something about what this first system is, the wanting system. Jaak calls it a seeking system. He used to call it a curiosity, interest, expectancy system. There are lots of different words to use to describe it. And it's generated using dopamine that comes out of a particular part of the upper brainstem, the midbrain, in the ventral tegmentum, and projects forwards to a range of brain structures, most famously the nucleus accumbens. Although it's a dopamine system, it usually comes with a letter label called D2 dopamine. D1 dopamine is the one that you might be more familiar with in Parkinson's disease, of course, or mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine. It doesn't make any great difference. We've known, by the way, since the middle of the last century, that this dopamine seems to be very important in superstitious behavior in animals, including in rats, which is interesting, especially in the light of some psychiatric disorders. Okay, so if we think that this is, I should say one other thing about the system. Although Jacques calls it the seeking system, I'm particularly taken with a word that Mark Solms uses to describe it, which is that it's a system that generates enthusiasm. That's the subjective experience. So let's think of it as an enthusiasm system, and then see what would happen if you turn the volume up on enthusiasm, or if you turn the volume down on enthusiasm. That might be helping us to understand the biology of the system better. So let's turn the volume up. And you can turn the volume up through two classes of recreational drugs, cocaine and amphetamines in particular, give you extra dopamine. They're dopamine agonists. And here's Sigmund Freud, who of course nearly came to fame, I suppose came to partial fame through his work on cocaine in the 1880s. It says it gives him exhilaration and lasting euphoria, an increase in self-control. It increases, he says, vitality and the capacity for work. Because remember I said earlier that these things are a goad without a goal. It gives you enthusiasm. It doesn't tell you what to do. Freud knows what he has to do. He's got 27 volumes of his collected works to write on. So he needs to spend his cocaine energy on, on writing stuff.
He has enough energy.
Exactly. Other people use their recreational drugs for other reasons, but it depends on your personal life circumstances. But if you want more enthusiasm, then you can temporarily get it through adding a dopamine agonist. I'm not, of course, recommending recreational drug use, and you will burn your receptors out and you'll feel much worse the next day. But you can increase temporarily the system very effectively through adding extra dopamine. Okay, so that's what happens when you turn the system up. What would happen if you turn the system down? Well, the best example we know of there is that remarkable disease for which we're living through the centenary of at the moment, which was originally called von Monekov disease or encephalitis lethargica. Hands up, anyone who's seen the film Awakenings or read the book? Oh, good, very good. So, of course, these patients have a selective set of damage to the ventral tegmental area. Interestingly, it's so selective that they don't lose consciousness, which you would get if you were a few millimeters further away, and it doesn't change their brain's emotion systems either. It just decreases their enthusiasm, if that's the right way of describing it. And Sachs, of course, talks about these patients being in suspended animation. Interestingly, by the way, if you read the book, something which isn't really in the film, it's not only that these patients lack the ability to move their bodies, they lack the ability to move their minds. So, you can decide now to think of what you had for breakfast or where you last went on holiday. They were unable even to do that because they can't generate the sense of agency that comes from this chemical, which adds so much value and so much energy to all of our mental lives. So that's the turn it down version, and here we have the turn it up version. We need, of course, psychiatric disorders in all of this, and we know that since about 1960, that organic psychiatry has been modifying the levels of dopamine, principally trying to lower dopamine in patients who have psychotic disorders, and it's particularly used, of course, with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, as it's sometimes described, the hallucinations and delusions, but also, of course, it will act against the manic element of bipolar mood disorder. So that's my first category, just a very whistle-stop tour. Dopamine is a particular category of feeling, that is seeking, enthusiasm, whatever you want to call it. It can be changed by recreational drug use. That's why it is a recreational drug, is that it gives you extra enthusiasm. And organic psychiatry needs it in order to try to treat psychiatric disorders because there's too much of it in some of our patients. Yes?
Can we also regulate our dopamine synthesis in our brains by changing our daily habits? What do you
Sure. I think we can manage our feelings in all sorts of important ways. Emotion regulation, which I'll talk about in a little while, can take the form either of, there's a whole model of it, but you can choose which events you're going to participate in. So you can avoid things which you know will be bad for you, or even when you end up in one of those life events, you can choose to reappraise it or reframe it and help to contain it. So, there's a whole, and that's, those are not thoughts that are particular to one category of basic emotion, but they're managing our feelings, I think, is at the heart of all the psychotherapies. Now, it's a very interesting question about the fact that they achieve that in 10 different ways. So I'm not going to stand here talking about why mindfulness patients get better and CBT patients get better, and I don't know who else I could choose in this list, but behavior modification patients get better, psychoanalytic patients get better, presumably for very different reasons. But I think emotion regulation is at the heart of them.
What about this specific behavior? Because I have a patient like that, so depressive patient and lack of motivation, and he really watches so many long times Netflix series. What is going on his brain about dopamine and motivation by watching passively something?
Well, I think that passivity is the big problem there. I don't want to choose a CBT example, but the obvious one would be that those patients can generate more agency for themselves by getting out into the world more. Rule 101 for CBT and depression is leave your bedroom. Go out there and try to expose yourself to things in life that you will find a greater sense of agency in. But you might also want to reflect on why the patient is choosing to ruminate about those those negative thoughts, which are often very unproductive. So I wouldn't want to prescribe a treatment regime, but I will say, because I just gave the TED talk on this topic, which was all about why I'm opposed to the comedy program Curb Your Enthusiasm. Do you have that here?
Yeah.
Okay. And I recommend instead that we need to cultivate our enthusiasm.
Can you repeat it?
Curb your enthusiasm.
C-U-R-B. It's a Larry David program. I don't know what the word curb means. It's a low frequency word in English. It means stop, to halt, to restrain your enthusiasm. But it's a comedy program. So my recommendation is that we need to cultivate enthusiasm. We need to find ways of bringing meaning to people's lives, because that's ultimately, these systems are about finding pleasure in novelty seeking and in unusual connections in the world. So all classes of new of novelty seeking, from intellectual life to to simple novel pleasures, seem to be driven by dopamine. And I don't know if you know how the chemistry of it works, but basically, when you see something new, dopamine fires, and we find it very pleasurable. But the more exposures you have to the same thing, the lower the dopamine levels become. So it gets bored, basically. So you need, novelty is a good thing. Gosh, just muttered something about marriages over here, so I'm not going to get caught up in that complicated question. But it is true that it seems to like variety.
And this patient is very rich, by the way.
Well,
so he's bored of anything, I guess.
Well, I think what brings individual life's meaning is surely enormously diverse. So no one can prescribe what your meaning should be, and I think it's a very interesting process for people to reflect on what it is that personally brings their meaning. It can be something that means is pointless to many other people. Britain is full of train spotters. I don't know if you have this phenomenon in Turkey or not. When my train arrives, there are sometimes people, usually middle-aged men, with cameras at the end of the platform taking photographs of trains. It's called train spotting. Do you not have it here?
No.
It was the title of a film actually in the 1990s. Train spotting. Someone can Google, if you Google it now, you'll find a picture of a middle-aged British man with a camera at the end of a train platform. They like to collect the numbers and see as many different kinds of trains as possible. And if that makes you happy, then good luck to them. But it's not, it wouldn't do it for me, you know. So, sorry if that's not a comprehensive answer to your question. But I do think, there's something I could have said a while ago. If we are thinking, which we might be, that there are four emotion systems, happiness, sadness, anger, and fear is a very bad way of describing it. I think the tragedy of being alive is that 3 of the 4 of those are negative. So, I think the philosophical truth is that if there are so many negative emotion systems, then bad things are inevitable. It's built into the system that you will have sadness, anger, and fear. It's just the way life is. So the alternative to this is to try to cultivate the brain's most positive emotion system, to make more meaning for yourself. You know, the one thing that we do know from thousands of years of reading books and studying history is that people who have a drive to achieve something remarkable seem to be very happy despite enormous adversity. You know, the world is full of people exploring the universe, and it hurts them and they put themselves at risk, and you know, but they love it because it's powerfully meaningful to them. And lots of people who are rich but not happy because they seem to lack this powerful force. So that's why I'm an enthusiast for building the brain's best source of positive emotion, and for realizing that you're never going to be able to avoid all the bad stuff. But can you build up a positive force that's more powerful than the negative ones? Sorry if that's a philosophical aside, and if it's not an answer. Any more questions? Shall I keep going? So, I've just talked about what I think are those 3 things. Seeking system that you can increase if you add one class of recreational drugs, the stimulants, and that psychiatrists might want to modify, particularly, by the way, lowering it in a number of disorders. Can we do the same 3 things, but for a different category of emotion? And let's move now to the liking category, not the wanting category. Okay? So here's Candace Pert, who in the 70s with Sol Snyder identified the brain's endogenous opiate system, which is one of the main chemistries that underpins attachment. So feelings of separation and sadness and loss result from very low levels of these attachment chemistries. And here's Candace Pert on this topic. So she was hospitalized, by the way, for a spinal injury. She fell off a horse when she had a small child. And here's her report. Not in addition to relieving all pain, it also seemed to obliterate any anxiety or discomfort I had as a result of being confined to a hospital bed and separated from my husband and young child. So she doesn't have those feelings of separation and sadness and loss because someone has injected her with the chemical that underpins those sorts of feelings. No surprise then, of course, that in recreational drug use, which of course principally are all the opiates, then we see people seeking alternative solutions, pharmacological solutions to their feelings of sadness and separation. Well, here's we talked about the guinea pig separation distress system. That's exactly the same thing. It does it in across all mammal species. And here is a nice review of major depression, and we see the front end of that system, the anterior cingulate. It's a terribly small area of activation in the study, but the evidence for the role of different parts of the cingulate, not only the anterior, but actually also the subgenual cingulate in anxiety and depression seems reasonably clear. And we've seen some attempts in pharmacology of trying to modify these systems in order to treat depression. Serotonin is the obvious one, although it hasn't been terribly successful. The opiates were the previously very successful solution. The problem is the addictive nature of the opiates. So they've been illegal for a very long time. Okay, so that's my second attempt at it then. We have a separation distress system, a sadness system, which is also modified, this time not by a drug you take to go out dancing. No one takes the opiates to go dancing. You take it for other reasons. And of course, it's at the heart of a disorder. It's one half of clinical depression. Okay, I'll say something about psychoanalysis, but very briefly. Firstly, of course, Freud said, who knows, biology may expect to give us the most surprising information. We cannot guess what answer will return in a few dozen years. So it is now, of course, a few dozen years later. So we're in a position to make a bit of a judge. I think there's a debate here about whether Freud's number of basic emotion systems, the number of drives, maps onto modern neuroscience. I lost this debate in Brussels, so I won't revisit it here. I still bear the scars from the summer, but I still think I'm right, which is that Freud is close for some, but I think further away for others. And I think it's also a very interesting question about whether other elements of the psychotherapies that have worldwide things all human beings have in common might use these basic emotion systems. Earlier today, Gotcha and I were talking about whether Jungian archetypes might have a foundation that is because we all, not because we have, what's Jung's word for the collective unconscious? Not because there's a collective unconscious, but because we all have the same basic emotion systems. There's only so many ways of us interacting with the world. I think some very interesting questions there for us. Right. So that's what I wanted to say about the basic emotions, because you can't talk about feelings without talking about them, but I really want to talk in particular about emotion regulation. Plainly, these are newer, cleverer bits of the brain, which are not directly going to change the levels of basic emotion systems. If you want to change those, you need pharmacology, you need organic psychiatry. But how can we help to manage our feelings? And this is the process that's become increasingly studied in experimental psychology. This remarkable graph, that's 1990 over there, and this is searches in journal articles for the word emotion regulation. The answer is 0, and this is 2012 when it's starting to go exponential, and that's at 8,000 hits, I think, in 2012. It's a field whose time has at last come. James Gross, who we've published a few of these papers with, has been at the heart of this process, and we've been interested in studying which brain areas might be involved in this. And you wouldn't expect that it's the old subcortical parts of the brain. They're the ones that generate feelings. So feelings are evolutionarily old, but the management of feelings is a new process. That's the one that we were interested in studying. So here's a couple of studies with my good friend and colleague Christian Salas, who's now back in Chile. Here's our first, well, it wasn't our first one to do, but it's the one I want to talk about first. It's called response modulation. That's a skill which involves either increasing or decreasing at will a basic emotion. So the task is we show people a video of something funny or sad, and we ask them to exaggerate the amount of funniness or sadness, or we ask them to hide the amount of funniness and sadness. It's a well-known task in the literature. And then we try this with patients with brain lesions to see who can't do the task. And the answer, and we don't need to worry about the graphs because we've got a nice picture. The answer is that patients with right frontal lesions and patients with right insular lesions have a huge deficit in this ability. They can't amplify or hide their feelings. And it probably is at the heart of some of their social difficulties that we see in patients with right frontal brain images. We were wondering, or you might be wondering, why is response modulation important? Well, I can think of two reasons. I can tell you why it's important to suppress emotions, and the answer is Schadenfreude. So the sad truth is that we are happy when our friends fail. But we hide it very well, because otherwise you wouldn't have any friends left. So, but if you watch people, and there's plenty of literature suggesting that, you know, when you're paired up with somebody else and they don't do very well, you have a sort of secret feeling of, I'm doing better than them. But in order to keep friends, you need to hide that. But of course, our right frontal patients lose that skill. And the other element, which I think is even more important, is the issue of contagion and repair. So imagine you wake up in a bad mood, you're going to go into work, and you could go into work and say, I've just had a dreadful day, and I'm sure today is going to be a disaster. That's not going to help anybody. Imagine if you could suppress the negative emotion and say something positive instead. Don't worry, I'm sure it's going to be great today. Make a joke, make the world a better place. Those people generate enthusiasm and joy and happiness in everybody else around them, and live a much better and happier life, of course. But our patients can't do that. Our right frontal patients, say what they think, which is not always the right answer in social situations, and can't seem to pull themselves out of difficult situations. And I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. So this is the role of right frontal brain areas in emotion regulation. We've also been able to identify a role for left frontal patients. This is a different kind of task, which is more verbally mediated. It's the classic task, actually, in the emotion regulation literature of reappraisal, which means taking a bad thing and making it better. So, you've just been dumped by the person that you love, so that's obviously not good news. You invite the person to reframe that more positively. And actually, many people are quite good at that. They say, oh, they were hopeless anyway, I never liked them. Or I'm sure I can find someone much better and more marvelous than the person that's just dumped me. Now, neither of those might be actually true, but they're quite optimistic ways of reframing the world. And without those positive reappraisals, you get caught in a cycle of rumination. That's the difficulty. And in this study, Christian and I are able to identify which patients can't do well on this task. And the short answer is that it's patients with left frontal lesions. We're even able, in an analysis of their cognitive abilities, to see which skills you need. And there are two executive function abilities that seem at the heart of this. The first of them is inhibition, and the second is verbal fluency. So we think we can see how you put the sticking plaster over the feeling of being dumped. If you're not happy with the dumped picture, you can try it instead for car crashes. So you show these people a picture. This is an IAPS picture of a car crash. Would anyone like to offer me a positive appraisal of that? Reappraisal? The most common one is at least the emergency services are there and they're going to receive, good help. And with modern cars, there's always a seat, an airbag or something that will be positive. So, what you need to do in order to generate that sort of reappraisal, firstly, is to temporarily inhibit the bad emotion. I've been dumped, I'm feeling sad. You need to sort of hold that down for a little while. But holding it down is effortful, and if you just hold it down for 10 seconds, then when you let it go, it's just going to come back again. You need a sticking plaster to keep it down, even when you aren't, so you don't have to engage the mental effort. And I've given you some sticking plasters, like maybe I'm going to meet somebody else better than the person who's just dumped me, or I never liked them anyway. Remember when they said something rude to my family? That sticking plaster will work even when you don't invest energy in it. And our patients seem to struggle to do that after left lesions. So here's a remarkable patient of ours. He's remarkable. He's like many of our other patients, he's very clever. He is a professor of sociology, and he describes very beautifully the nature of this experience using this remarkable phrase, sticky sadness. So here's here's his left-sided lesion. So he had difficulties walking. He says, having difficulties walking is something that saddens me. But then I have this experience that, well, I know it's okay to feel sad, but this is not just feeling sad. This is like a sticky sadness, which makes me feel sadder than I should. And then he says, it's like when you step in the mud. And he said he can't get his sort of foot out of the mud. It's like walking through something sticky and difficult. So that's why he ruminates on his difficulties. It's because he can't generate a more positive worldview. Intriguingly, I think I might have a good quote here, which is that because he's this executive, he can't come up with the reframing himself, but somebody else can do the job for him. And in his case, he's fortunate enough that his wife can do this. So, if you read from the top, when I'm in the sticky sadness, it's very difficult to change the way I think. Here, my wife is of great help. She is the one that pulls me out of such states, because when I'm feeling sticky, it's written all over my face. So then she starts asking questions. What is wrong? Why do you feel like this? She does it until I'm able to come up with an answer. And she always asks me from the other side. She says, we've moved forward in this. You're walking well enough. If we need to do more exercise, we will do it. It's as if she helps me to get out of that place by putting another image in my mind, like those old machines where you pass slide projectors for anyone under the age of whatever age that people have never seen them. She removes the bad slide and puts in a good one. She removes one and says, now look at this one. Instead of using those specs, use this one. Then I can start to see that new one. If you ask me if I can change the slide by myself, I don't think so. So our patients, we know, need two skills: inhibiting bad emotion and building a new linguistic ability to make a sticking plaster to hold it down. That's what makes a reappraisal work. And for these reasons, Professor F over here has great difficulty in trying to achieve that. So that was the next thing that I wanted to say, is that we know something, we think about the regulation of emotion and its biological basis. It's not in the ancient brain, it's in the new, clever outside bits of the brain, probably more in the frontal lobes than anywhere else. And I'll finish by talking about something, another strand that we took to the neuroscience of psychotherapy's question, which is not to ask which bits of the brain do you need for the psychotherapies, but to ask the opposite question, which is which bits of the brain don't you need, which is an interesting thought. And I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we don't need memory, amazingly, or at least we don't need a particular category of memory, which is episodic memory. We've known since the middle of the last century that we run in parallel a number of memory systems. You probably, or everyone has heard of the famous episodic memory systems that are run from the hippocampus through the fornix and so on, forwards into other areas of the diencephalon. But we also know, since the middle of the last century, in fact since longer than that, that we have emotion-based memory systems that are based on completely different brain systems, like the ones I talked about earlier. So,
Sorry, can I ask something?
shoot.
How about the masochistic personality disorder? Because they're inhibiting their positive emotions and they are more reinforcing the negative circuits. So it's the challenging thing about Freudian's hedonistic philosophy.
Sure. I think there are sometimes gains which are less obvious than the superficial.
Secondary gains.
Yeah, I suppose. And also, I'm no expert on masochism, but people have a life history in which something that looks to you from the outside as punishing actually has been rewarding in another context. There've been other positive social engagement elements, maybe pathological ones that they've got from it.
The joy is maybe defined more pathologically for them.
Maybe something that looks negative has actually got the attention of other people, and that is a
That's
gain in
their
itself.
positive.
I think every case is unique, and I'm no masochism expert, but thank you for those examples. So we've known, by the way, for 100 more years about the existence of these two independent systems. Who's familiar with Claperade's original patient? Not very many people. Okay, so Edward Claperade's Swiss, I think, psychiatrist, who does one of the least ethical experiments in my world. So he meets a patient who's amnesic. That is, when I say amnesic, I mean doesn't have the hippocampal episodic memory system, the conscious memory system. And he meets her every day on the ward round. He says hello, and she of course doesn't recognize him because she's amnesic. She can't remember anything that happened 5 minutes ago. Then he does the thing you'll never get past the modern ethics committee, which is on one day he takes a pin and puts it in the palm of his hand and reaches out to shake hands with her. So of course, when she shakes hands with him, she gets stuck on his pin. We tried to get that past an ethics committee today. And the question is, what happens the next day when he goes on the ward round? Because he reaches out his hand to shake her hand, and anyone wants to take a guess? And of course she doesn't want to shake hands with him. He asks her why, and she has a nice sort of Victorian answer to the question. I think she says, surely a lady has the right not to shake a gentleman's hand. So she knows she doesn't like him. She just doesn't know, she doesn't remember the episode on which her dislike is based. And Turnbull and Damasio replicated that in an experiment in the 90s, in which they brought a patient into the lab. They had 2 confederates. One person was horrible to him all week, and the other person was charming to him all week. And at the end of the week, he has to guess which one he trusts or not. And he's well above chance, but doesn't remember episodically the patient. We replicated that in a patient of ours. They don't need to know the details, but he's profoundly amnesic. And this is his performance on an emotion-based learning task in which he's no different from age-matched controls. We've shown the same thing in Alzheimer's patients. So these episodic memory systems can be profoundly damaged, and yet emotion-based learning remains intact. This led me to think that I wonder what the transference relationship in psychotherapy is like. Which of these systems is it mediated on? Is it based on what you consciously remember in your session, or is it based on the emotional tone of that therapy experience? I also thought, by the way, it might depend on what your training was, because if you're doing CBT, you would think you'd need conscious recall, because CBT is all about doing your homework. You know, you work on something in an hour, and then you're supposed to practice it a lot during the week, and then you come back the next week. But if you can't remember what you did, then how are you going to make any gain? So, but actually, of course, CBT turns out to be about more than doing your practice. So, I asked a colleague and friend of mine, Paul Moore, who's this gentleman over here. He's an Irish psychotherapist, to do what I think is the most heroic experiment in all of neuropsychoanalysis. That is to take a patient into psychotherapy who's profoundly amnesic and remembers nothing from the last 2 minutes, and Paul sees him for, God love it, 72 sessions of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which is remarkable. It's all in the paper, this paper here, which looks a bit small. 2017, it came out in Frontiers. And we learned a lot of things. I won't describe them all. I will talk only about one of them, which we call the Liffey Bridge incident. And this is several sessions of psychotherapy, all about this particular bridge over the river in Dublin. It's the River Liffey, which is why it's the Liffey Bridge. And we see what happens over a 6-week period. Our patient, by the way, is profoundly amnesic. He had diabetic ketoacidosis. He was an alcoholic and a badly managed diabetic, and he blew his hippocampi. And he's hospitalized, he's in a care facility, 24-hour round-the-clock care. He remembers nothing 2 minutes later. So you might ask yourself why anything is changing across the 6-week period. You know, it seems very strange. We'll work across it. If you can just try to remember this bridge, by the way. So it's got traffic running in the middle of it, and then it has 2 pedestrian walkways on either side of it. So here's what happens in session 5. So here, do you know what they call that pedestrian bridge that crosses the Liffey down there, just below where they're meeting? So Paul, the psychotherapist, says the halfpenny bridge is the local name for it. It's abbreviation for half penny. No, he says, it's not the halfpenny bridge. It's a new pedestrian bridge. And Paul says, that's not a pedestrian bridge. Traffic can go across that bridge. So they're having a debate here about this. I won't spend too much time on it, but I'd like you to see them not getting on about it during this session. It's just a little pedestrian. It's only from here to the wall wide apart. I'm telling you, no cars can cross it. Paul says, I drove over that bridge. So they have a fight. I like this last line at the end here. Come in next week and tell me you drove across it. I'll give you 1,000 euros, 10,000 euros, 1,000,000 euros. And they both laugh. You wouldn't get your car up on it. It's something Mr. Bean would try, to cross over it with his car. I don't know if you have Mr. Bean, the comedy character. So, by the way, they really got on, the patients. They shared lots of material in common. They both have an interest in films and in sports. Just to give you an idea, if you have listened with the psychotherapeutic ear, the patient's two favorite films are Escape from Alcatraz and The Great Escape. So you can see how much he enjoys being in his care facility. The patient uses these two themes to repair spaces in the discussion. So whenever there's a bit of a gap, he says, oh, have you watched any sports on the weekend? Oh, what's your favorite film? And they manage things like that. So what happens, by the way, that was session 5, is once a week psychotherapy. I'm skipping on because it keeps coming up, but they're still talking about it 6 sessions later, and now the patient has managed to get released from his care facility in order to go and check the bridge out. So I'd like you to see how much of a journey our patient has passed on. So I went down to look at that bridge. The psychotherapist says, yes, so you did, yeah? And okay, I'm wrong. Ha! But you can see over the bridge from both sides of it, though. And the patient says, because it's attached to a bigger bridge. So he's claiming that he's still partially right, but not. So it stayed in your mind. You know, I didn't realize that the footbridge was sort of part of the bridge. So here's a psychotherapy interpretation. It's very important to the bridge and how the bridge was remembered and how it was brought here. Because I think it's probably one of the few things we've engaged in that we'd had a strong disagreement about. He says. And then I like this last little bit because they start finishing each other's sentences. That was very important for you to try and figure it out. When I had one opinion and the patient finishes and I had another. So they really developed a rapport. For a man who can't remember something from 2 minutes ago. And there are many interesting things about it. I think the most interesting, although it's a little bit speculative, is what happened towards the end of the therapy. Very important actually for counter-transference lesions. So here's the challenge that Paul faces towards the last session. It's only 2 hours of psychotherapy, and Paul has told the patient, like any of us would, that they're terminating. But of course the patient can't remember that they're terminating. And so Paul has a serious counter-transference problem. To what extent should he keep reminding the patient or not? And it's a real debate. You can read about it in the paper. But the remarkable thing is that in those last few sessions, themes of loss and death and so on keep recurring across every time. So there's a sense in which our patient is aware that they're terminating. And this is the most beautiful example of it for me, which is about loss that isn't really loss, I suppose. And the patient in the final session talks about where he went on holiday. So these are the cliffs of Moher on the west coast of Ireland, in Galway. And because you don't have wind and difficult weather like we do, I can tell you that when the wind comes in from the Atlantic, it blows against the cliffs and blows upwards. So incredibly, you have a vertical wind, if you can believe such a thing. And the patient talks about how as a child he goes there with a football, not the heavy ones that they play adults with, but the little plastic balls that you get when you're a small child that are so light to kick. And here it is. So the patient says, the cliffs of Moher, I used to kick the ball out over the cliffs and the ball would come straight back at you. He said, I never lost the ball over those cliffs. So, you can try to get rid of something, but actually it will still keep coming back at you. Everyone used to walk down the cliffs from the cottage we were staying in. I always wanted to run and jump off to get pushed back by the wind, presumably like this. Good childcare advice, but I was never allowed to. because it doesn't work for children the same way it does for balls. He says, it always amazed me that you could kick a ball as hard as you could out over the sea and it would just come floating back. So I think there's a sense in which, firstly, by the way, the patient also made therapeutic gain. The care workers in his home who had difficulty with his insulin regulation described that his anger levels were reduced. He was much more calm and relaxed. But of course, he remembers nothing of all of those hours that Paul spoke about. Okay, so I mean, the short version of my talk is really our patients suffer mainly from feelings, and I think the lesson, the bridge with the psychotherapies is twofold. Firstly, it's about basic emotions, which are old and which may, I think, best be tackled by pharmacotherapy. Has comes with many limitations, of course, which I'd be happy to list. I did in my TED talk, but are at the heart of feelings. But they're not the only solution to the problem. The second way in is presumably emotion regulation. Those are not ancient brain systems. These are run by new, clever bits of the brain and mind, and they can be learned, they can be practiced, and they can be supported through all sorts of other approaches. So I'm optimistic about the future for all sorts of reasons. And I'll share with you my favorite Freud quote, which I agree with every word except one, and I'll tell you which one it is, but I'll read it out for you first. The deficiencies in our description would probably vanish if we were already in a position to replace the psychological terms by physiological or chemical ones. And the word that I disagree with is the word replace. No one's trying to replace psychological terms with physiological ones. You don't need to. Because you can use, by understanding the psychological term, like enthusiasm, and the chemical term, like dopamine, you can see that they are two sides of the same coin. And our field is so much the richer from understanding not only what the biology of the system is, but what it feels like when the biology is working. They're not replacing each other, we're just looking at the same phenomenon in two different ways. I think first it's a science, which we've lacked for so many years in this area. It's clearly a link between psychiatry and for example, neurology. But I think most importantly, I think it offers a real neuroscience of psychotherapy. We've known since the middle of the last century that psychotherapy works, but how is another matter, And not only do I think that a neuroscience of psychotherapy helps us to be better psychotherapists, but also it helps to get the support of people who fund the psychotherapies, for whom neuroscience is a real currency for, if it's in the brain, it must be real. I don't happen to think that that's especially true, but I think there are some people out there in the world of politics and medicine for whom that is powerful. So I would very much like us to build that. So that's why I'm an optimist. But I'm also an optimist because I'm trying to cultivate my enthusiasm. So I don't know how long it took there, Gotcha, but should we stop and see where we are?
For questions.
So thank you very much. Thanks for listening. It's a pleasure.
So we can take the questions and comments from the audience.
Just not about masochism, because I've got nothing more clever to say about masochism.
That was a bit tricky question.
Well, I think it's a good one.
Maybe one comment. I think neuropsychoanalysis is doing a great effort in terms of translating these two dimensions to each other, and we still have hope for Freud's quotation, I think.
There's huge hope. Something I was actually saying to one of you earlier, which is that I think there are some people who think that the direction of travel of benefit is that the psychotherapies can benefit from all the extra neuroscience. But I think actually it goes in both directions. The neurosciences have really lacked thinking about feelings or thinking about more complex concepts like defense. And so many of the papers that we've published over the years have been about taking psychoanalytic concepts and explaining them or demonstrating them empirically to the neuroscience community, because they have the problem of 2% versus 38% that I talked about earlier. If no one's going to ask another question, I'll give another sentence worth of quotation. We have a strange quote in Britain called the Birmingham screwdriver.
Burning the screwdriver.
A Birmingham screwdriver. So if everyone knows what a screwdriver is.
Tornado.
Okay. But here's the quote, which is that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. And you can't hammer in a screw, of course. You need. So I think that I don't like the term cognitive neuroscience because it's got the word cognitive in it. If the only tool you have is cognition, then every solution looks like every problem looks like a cognitive solution. So we are trying to bring emotion-themed solutions to problems. In your introduction, you mentioned delusional beliefs. My cognitive neuroscience colleagues think that confabulation is caused by executive impairment. And we've published plenty of papers showing that can't be true, and that actually there are emotional reasons for why our patients believe strange things. They wouldn't have thought of the idea because the only tool they have is a hammer. So you need to bring the emotional tool together with the cognitive tool to the field. And I look forward to seeing the end of cognitive neuroscience, not because I hate the neuroscience part. Obviously, I'm very keen on the neuroscience part, but I don't like the word cognitive. I would like to see us just talking about mental neuroscience or something, I don't know. Or affective neuroscience would be lovely.
Affective neuroscience.
So can we say that delusional patients have an enthusiasm for their delusions?
I can tell you that in our patients, the ones who have medial frontal lesions, bilateral medial frontal lesions, 100% of them believe that they're in more positive situations than they otherwise are. We did a survey of literature for reduplication for place, and there's only 16 patients in the series. Those patients go to 2 different places. About half of them, their delusional beliefs are of exotic places. They're in a bistro in the south of France, on a barge in the Caribbean, or a yacht going down the Nile, which is quite interesting. So half of them go exotic, and the other half go to safe places. They go back to their family home, to their old school, their old university, in one case to their doctor's home, which you can interpret whichever you want. And so, at least in our patients, they seem to devolve to more positive places. We think that they have a choice between a difficult reality, which is usually they're in hospital, or a pleasant delusion, and they've lost the emotion regulation system that allows them to tolerate that, because the adult achievement for all of us except Donald Trump is to realize that we're not perfect, and that actually sometimes we make mistakes, and he of course never makes a mistake, so it's much easier for him. But for the rest of us, being an adult is all about understanding that we're not as clever and as charming and as smart as we might like to believe. And we think that these medial frontal lobe areas allow you to do that. They allow you to say, well, I know that I'm not perfect, therefore I can look at reality. And our patients lack that system. Now, the great challenge for us is to understand why the delusional beliefs of psychiatric patients are not positive. But their problems are not caused by medial frontal lesions. But in our patients, our medial frontal lesion patients are very positive. I could say more on the topic, but I'm going to take that question. I'm happy to talk to you later about it. Yes?
You talked about there is no asymmetry in the subcortical regions. Does this have a clinical output or a behavioral output?
I don't think particularly, not that I can think of. Only for the asymmetries cortically, I'm interested in brain injury, so our left lesion patients are different from our right lesion patients. and a little different for people who are ambidextrous and so on. But in the psychiatric world, I don't see any very obvious links. There's a little bit of a debate. There's some bits of psychiatry we still have a left versus right hemisphere argument. There's a Master and His Emissary book that's been out there for 10 years, which is about different thinking styles. But it doesn't really map onto our worldview, which is really about an ancient core and new cleverness. So I don't have anything very strong to say about it. It's an interesting question. Yes?
So, if I catch right, you say that the cortical lesions does not create as strong consequences as about emotions, like subcortical ones.
Well, I mean, it's almost impossible to produce subcortical lesions that get rid of core emotions without making the patient unconscious, interestingly, because you need the upper brainstem, which is at the core of conscious awareness. In fact, remember I mentioned something about consciousness on the Isaac Newton slide. We think that the reason we generate consciousness is in order to have feelings. That feelings are the primary motivator for consciousness in the first place. I mean, obviously our cortical lesions produce very important emotional consequences for our patients, but not in terms of the range of their emotions. So our brain injury patients still get angry as always they did, but now they can't contain their anger anymore. They get fearful as they always did, but now they're overwhelmed by fear. And they get sad like they always did, but they can't move on from sadness. They ruminate with those, the patient's sticky sadness. So it's basically the same range of emotions. It's just that they can't hold them in anymore. And then the question becomes how to treat feelings you can't manage. And you might say that one way in is to turn up or down the levels of the neurochemistry, and a completely separate way in is to try to help the patient to develop strategies, ways of better managing their feelings. And I think that those two approaches, the pharmaco versus psychotherapies, are targeting completely different brain regions. And I think we're only just starting to understand the limitations of each of them and how you might synchronize them together better. I think that I don't want to speak too much for multidisciplinary teams and the challenge of the century, but I think there's a long way to go with better synchronization of the two.
And secondly, your patient groups are generally neurological patients with a lesion. So does it still work for the patients, for example, who have hardcore myodepressive disorder, like
Hardcore?
myodepressive disorder?
I missed that middle word.
Yeah, I mean very strong depressive.
So much clinical depression.
Yeah, treatment-resistant myodepressive disorder.
Well, I mean, we know that treatments for clinical depression work. Not all of them work, though. Let me take a very good example for you. Helen Mayberg did some very interesting work 10 years ago now on patients with untreatable clinical depression, profoundly depressed patients, and did some electrical brain stimulation work on them. I don't know if you know Mayberg's work, but they target. Where are we? Here we are. They target the subgenual cingulate, just anterior cingulate, but underneath the genu of the corpus callosum for ESB, and in some patients get complete, remarkable changes in their depressive state. I don't know why those patients were untreatable by pharmacology, whereas the other ones weren't, or by psychotherapy, and why brain stimulation works in those. Depression is probably multi-causal and many different ways of treating, but it's another way of getting to the sadness system. I'm not saying that every patient with depression needs electrical brain stimulation. Helen Mayberg, M-A-Y-B-U-R-G, I think. She's a neurologist. and remarkable work here. Any more? Yes.
A comment actually. You talked about Newton's idea of saying that.
Gravity.
Yeah, gravity, and it's the same that does this and keeps the orbits of planets. And there was this consciousness question mark at the bottom of the slide. So I think we can talk about the three things in the same way, like force, the Newtonian perspective, but a more general perspective, like the general relativity perspective, will be combining them with consciousness, because we can't combine them with consciousness in our, so to speak, Newtonian perspective. But the other perspective, that's combining everything. The two sides of the same coin uses this term, but we can't bridge this gap. I think in the future we might or might not bridge this gap, and that would be the general relativity of neuroscience or psychotherapy. It's just a comment.
Sure, I'll say something, but I mean, obviously, solving what we call the hard problem of consciousness would be, is the Nobel Prize waiting to be achieved. There is another talk that I can give on the core of the self, which I will give you the 30-second summary of. For those of you who remember the anatomy of the midbrain of the brainstem. Maybe you remember those or not, I don't know. That's the substantia nigra, that's the red nucleus. So this area over here, the periaqueductal grey, is an upper brainstem structure that's at the heart of emotion. We also know that a number of nuclei in this particular version, they are the raphe nuclei of the reticular activating system, which of course is at the heart of consciousness. We know that because lesion to those brain areas produces coma. And this area over here, just on the medial part of the substantia nigra, is the ventral tegmentum, which of course we said is at the heart of the dopamine producing areas, which give that sense of agency, of enthusiasm that we talked about earlier. And firstly, I don't know if you know how big your brainstem is. The answer is it's the same size as your thumb. So this is the top, a slice through the top end of your brainstem. That's how big it is. And these brain areas that are next to each other, but they're not anatomically identical, seem to be at the heart of, you can call it the self if you want. So how feelings are connected to consciousness, are connected to agency, is a very interesting question. That's not the solution to general relativity. It's at least, I think I've localized where the problem is. If we can tackle this, then we've gone a long way towards addressing a very important problem. If no one has another question, I'll say another sentence on this topic, which is that I'm an enthusiast for artificial intelligence, but I'm something of an opponent of artificial consciousness, because once you solve this problem, by the way, you can generate artificial consciousness, and that produces the problem of slavery, which is that I have this smartphone over here has lots of artificial intelligence. It's cleverer than me at doing arithmetic, and it's got a better memory than me, but I don't have to ask it to follow me around. I don't have to ask its permission. I can ignore it for hours, But as soon as it becomes sentient, then I probably need to give it a vote. It's a real problem that faces us, I think, in this century, the problem of artificial consciousness. So the intellectual in me would like to see the solution to this problem, but the humanist in me is a little worried about some of the implications. So, sorry for that. Sorry?
They're right to be worried.
Yeah, well, you're quite right. Was there a question over there?
After all these talks, my question is going to sound a little bit simple, but
they're often the very best questions, like why is the sky blue and why is the grass green? Be amazed.
Yeah, you're right. So therefore, my question starts with some kind of an anecdote or metaphor. So the problem with the psychiatric agents or the psychiatric pharmaceuticals is mainly the side effects. And think of when your car breaks down and you try to repair it, but you take the motor oil and drop it anywhere of the motor, or anywhere on the engine. Therefore, it goes to the places where it's supposed to go, but it also goes to the places that it does not supposed to go. Therefore, we, the patients, experience side effect. As the psychiatry and pharmaceutical agents develops and sophisticates, we might find a solution to this, and we might to have better selective agents. And how do you say how this will affect the psychotherapy? How will it go on, and how will it change the course of the interventions that we can do with our mouth by talking, the talking cure, and how can we change? And do you think that in the future, is there any possibility that the psychotherapy will overcome psychopharmaceutical agents in terms of symptom relief?
And that was a simple question.
I tried my best.
I'll try to give you a reasonably brief answer. I'm not an opponent of pharmacotherapy, but I recognize all the challenges you have. Of course, incomplete symptom relief, variability between patients, side effects, some of the gain is placebo, you know. But for some patients it does show gain, and we can't ignore it. You're right that we will get better at targeting it. You're correct also that the secret is in the synchronies here, and we're not nearly good enough at that. The easiest synchrony we've seen for a very long time, which is using pharmacotherapy as a temporary relief, so a patient can get good enough to be able to work with psychotherapy, and then you can withdraw the pharmacotherapy. That's the easiest one of them all. I think the next easiest way in for us is for us to understand how you might target the pharmacotherapy at a particular category of emotion system and speak to the psychotherapist so that they know they're also working on that same system. So we're starting to speak the common language of basic emotion systems rather than, you know, the more general use of these drugs. And also, there's some variation between them that we don't understand in terms of which aspects of basic emotion systems they are targeting. So let's just choose the sadness system: oxytocin, prolactin, serotonin, and the endogenous opiates. At least 4 different neurotransmitter systems on the way in. I don't know any work which shows which aspects of the basic emotion systems each of those tackle, and how that might help you choose between whether you're going to use an opiate. Well, it's very hard to use the opiate one, so a serotonin-based one versus any of the others. So there's just a huge amount of work to be done here across this century. You have to keep all the psychiatrists and psychotherapists busy for decades. There's plenty of work still to be done. Gotcha.
One last question, maybe. How can we define psychological well-being universally? If we define it only by hedonistic philosophy, like decreasing pain and suffering and increasing happiness, I think we will have a culture-specific problem, especially in Asian countries. Like in Japan, sadness is not a feeling that people try to avoid. Sadness has a pride in it, so they are proud to be sad. They respect sadness. So, but in America, we know that the affective neuroscience personality norms are different. They are reinforcing the positive effect more. And in Japan, fear and sadness are higher than in America. So one is like euphoric, one is like dystemic on the opposing sides of the world. So how can we apply the Western psychotherapy to Japan, for instance?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'll give you my perspective is a little, it stands a little in relation to the Stoic philosophy position. I mean, ultimately, I was always taken with the definition of, the ability to love and work to being the ultimate achievements rather than happiness. And loving people and working hard is they're often not the most pleasant of experiences, but they're ultimately very rewarding in the longer run. I think the Stoic philosophy position is that some negative emotions are inevitable, but overcoming them and you know, seeing the longer game can be a very you know, can be beneficial. And that's not a particularly hedonistic position, and maybe a little closer to those Japanese ones.
There are cultures who believe that life is suffering. So.
But if that brings you meaning, just to go back to that question earlier, you know, then that is in itself is going to be intrinsically rewarding. You know, you're being able to tolerate negative emotions can be a very good thing. You see a lot of happy people living in very restrained circumstances when they feel they have a purpose. It's the lack of purpose that's the goal in all of this. And it seems to me that that dopamine system is at the heart of that sense of meaning and purpose. And in fact, we see it interestingly going awry in patients who have too much dopamine without meaning, who I'm thinking of as manic patients. You know, that manic phase, those patients really see overwhelming meaning in the world for no good reason at all, as far as I can tell. You know, but it's presumably driven by you know, by excessive dopamine. So we also know that the support of communities and our close relationships seem to be at the heart of happiness, and many systems of meaning, like religious or scientific or whatever, sporting, you know, bring people together as a sense of community towards a greater purpose, even if it's your football team. Not that I want to knock football teams, but you know, it's, you know, if that's what makes you happy, and Britain is full of people who seem to get more meaning out of their football team than they do out of their jobs. So you know, if that's what makes you happy, then you know, good luck to them. I don't know if that's a good answer to it all, but
long topic to discuss. Yeah.
Not a topic.
Long topic.
Well, yeah, I drove past the Galatasaray Stadium on the way there.
Oh,
I was thinking of them.
Any other questions or comments? So we would like to thank Professor.
Thank you very much for your time on a Saturday night, for heaven's sake.